Good evening and welcome to the Langley Adams Library. Thank you for coming. We'll wait and see what our weather decides to do. Hopefully we'll hit it at just the right time.
It's a good solid building though, right?
Concrete, the very best. It's been working with all the digging that's been going on. So, right. I wanted to let you know about one of the programs that we'll be doing in August. On the 18th, we'll be having author Joseph Gallo come, and that's going to be at 6:30 on Monday, August 18th, and he'll be talking about his book, Boston, Bronze and Stone Speak to Us, and so it's about all the different sculptures in Boston, in various North End, Waterfront, Faneuil Hall, Markets, everywhere. The 18th at 6:30, so hopefully you can make it for that too. But tonight, we have Jeremy Detremont, who is here to talk about lighthouses of New England and the people who kept them. This is actually his third trip here. It's been a couple years, and this is his third lecture, different lecture.
Yeah.
So.
Ghost stories last time, and as I told you, I told somebody earlier, if we get thunderstorms, I can switch to ghost stories.
Yes, which was fascinating.
Especially if the lights go out.
Yeah.
It was
We'll love a
fascinating.
campfire.
So, Jeremy also does tours for some of the haunted ones as well. So,
Maybe I can
yeah.
say a little bit about that at the end. Yeah.
So I just wanted to introduce Jeremy, and he's written the Lighthouse Handbook, Ocean Mary, yes, Lighthouses of Massachusetts.
Which is out of print, unfortunately.
He's done over a dozen different books, and I think he brought maybe about 6 of them. 6 different ones with us.
4 or 5 anyway, I think.
Excellent.
Got some copies of the Lighthouse Handbook up here and some in the other room and a couple other books, but I'll say a little bit more at the end in case.
And a brand new one.
Yeah. Co-written with a daughter of a lighthouse keeper called Everyday Heroes, True Story of a Lighthouse Family. I have a couple of copies of that with me, and it's got a lot of good stories, including some good storm stories, and there's a couple of hurricanes in there, so it's very dramatic.
Perfect. So, welcome here again. I'm glad to have you back, and welcome everybody, and enjoy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and we get a little mood lighting maybe, because they don't need to see me. Is this, I guess this is how we decided it was, this is good. Never mind, you don't need to shut that
We
off.
can do one
Yeah,
more.
this is fine, right? Can see the, yeah, so this is fine. We're okay, never mind. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. I know some of you have been here before when I've been here, and it's nice to see you again. Nice to have a bunch of friendly faces here tonight. My topic for tonight is a little more general than the last couple of times I've been here. You know, I think I've said it before when I've lectured here before. I've been doing lighthouse stuff for about 30 years, give or take. Actually, that's a little bit better. I can see the pictures a little better. That's perfect, thank you. So I've been doing lighthouse stuff for about 30 years, and I'll say a little bit more later tonight about how I first got inspired to get interested in maritime history. But the thing, you know, I started photographing lighthouses in the 80s, and that's what first got me interested. But it's the thing that has kept me fascinated by lighthouses and has kept me researching them and writing about them and talking about them is the people of the lighthouses. And you know, these people were so devoted to keeping that light no matter what, and to me they're unsung American heroes, lighthouse keepers and their families. Our nation was built on maritime commerce, and actually most of the world, you could say that for. And without efficient lighthouse keepers and an efficient navigation system, you couldn't have had the safe movement of commerce and people on the water. So these people did a great service to our country. And it's also important to note that most lighthouses are still used for navigation. Some of them aren't, but most of them are. The Coast Guard still maintains the lights if they're still used for navigation, but the lights are all automated now. So the traditional way of life of lighthouse keepers is fading into the past. We have really no more traditional lighthouse keepers in this in this country. I'm going to say a little bit more about our one lighthouse keeper in this country in a little while. But the traditional way of life of keeping lighthouses is really in the past. So it's I'm trying to do my part to keep these stories alive the best I can. So with that said, I'm going to start in what seems like a logical place to start with the first lighthouse in North America. And any of you who are here for my ghost story, there's going to be a little overlap here. Some of this story was included in my ghost story lecture as well. But I want to tell you about the first lighthouse and the first lighthouse keeper in North America. This is a picture I took of the present Boston Light a few years ago at sunset. The first lighthouse in Boston Harbor was established in 1716. Of course, there were other lighthouses in the world. There were lighthouses in England and Spain and France. In fact, you know, there were lighthouses going back to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians and Phoenicians and other cultures. So it was far from the first lighthouse in the world. But the first lighthouse in North America was Boston Light. Boston, of course, was a leading port in colonial America. There was a lot of trade going on, a lot of fishing and so forth going in and out of the harbor by the early 1700s. So the merchants and mariners of Boston petitioned the colonial government for a lighthouse. And it was established in September 1716. I'll show you a drawing of what the first lighthouse looked like. It was about a 50-foot stone tower, and it was originally lit with candles, what they called spermaceti candles from the sperm whale. Not too long after that, it was switched to whale oil. Whale oil lamps were the primary means of lighting lighthouses for a long time, until it was eventually replaced by kerosene in the later 1800s, and of course eventually by electricity. Anyway, so a 50-foot stone lighthouse with a keeper's house next to it. And the first lighthouse keeper on the North American continent hired to take care of this light was a man named George Worthylake. And he was a man who had grown up on one of the other harbor islands. He and his wife had 5 kids, but only 2 of them moved to the island with him. I guess the others were older. So he and his wife moved to Little Brewster Island, which is where the lighthouse is, in outer Boston Harbor, September 1716. He and his wife and 2 daughters, also a family servant and 2 slaves. There are actually 2 black slaves at this lighthouse. There were slaves at a couple of the early colonial lighthouses. We don't know much about them. Not much was written about them, unfortunately. But there was a man and a woman. And you know, I really wish we could find more information about them, but we know very, very little about them. Oops, I shouldn't show you that picture yet. That's a little sneak preview. But anyway, George Worthylake had a terrible time as a keeper. First of all, the colonial government didn't want to pay him much. They thought they were doing him a big favor, giving him a house to live in and letting him farm the land and fish and so forth. So they paid him very little, and he complained about that, but they didn't give him a raise. He had to do extra things to make money to feed his family. He served as a harbor pilot for incoming vessels, and he tried having a flock of sheep, and that didn't work out very well at all. He had 59 sheep. One day they wandered out on a sand spit off Little Brewster Island at low tide. Whenever I say that, I feel like I don't need to finish the thought. The tide came in, and that was the end of his flock of sheep. So the poor guy had a tough time. In November of 1718, George Worthylake went into Boston with his wife and one of their 2 daughters, mainly to pick up his pay, but they 3 of them attended. They went with a family servant as well. They attended church in Boston on Sunday. On Monday morning, he picked up his pay, and they were returning to Boston Light. They were in a sloop, probably similar to the vessel you see here. They picked up a family friend at one of the other islands, and they anchored off Boston Light. The male slave on the island, Shadwell was his name, paddled the canoe out to meet the landing party. There was not a storm going on. Again, it was November, so the water, I'm sure, was very cold. Nobody's sure why this happened, but for whatever reason, probably just because the canoe was overloaded, it capsized, and all 6 people on the canoe drowned. So, you know, our first lighthouse keeper really came to a tragic end, and this was huge front page news of its day. Cotton Mather, this is the picture I started to show you there. This is the triple gravestone of George, Ann, and Ruth Worthylake in the Cops Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End. Cotton Mather, the famous preacher in Boston, preached a sermon about this. Benjamin Franklin, 12 years old, living in Boston at the time, wrote a poem called The Lighthouse Tragedy and hawked copies on the streets of Boston. So big news of its time. I did tell this, basically the same story in my ghost story talk, but I'm not going to continue in that direction now. But a lot of people do think that the spirit of George Worthylake is still kind of hanging around at Little Brewster Island there. But anyway, it's interesting to note that the second keeper at Boston Light, who went out to replace Worthylake, also drowned after 2 weeks on the job. So the first 2 keepers of Boston Light died a couple of weeks apart from each other. As far as I know, no keeper has drowned out there since then. Of course, at the time, people thought the island was cursed. In the Revolution, of course, Great Britain occupied Boston Harbor for a few months in 1776. Mostly they left around the spring of 1776. A few vessels hung around until June. When the last British vessels left Boston Harbor in June of 1776, their last act was to set a time charge at Little Brewster Island, and they completely destroyed that first lighthouse. So the lighthouse we have today was actually built 7 years later. There were 7 years, went 7 years with no lighthouse, and then Governor John Hancock ordered that the lighthouse be rebuilt, and it was built in 1783. By the way, the federal government, the new federal government, took over lighthouses in 1789. August 7th, 1789, and right now there's an effort to get August 7th named National Lighthouse Day as an annual thing. I don't know if you've seen any news about that, but there are some people trying to make that happen. So, anyway, so 1783 the lighthouse was rebuilt, and that's the lighthouse we have today with some changes. And I'm going to skip ahead in history about 150 years or so in the interest of time, because I could talk all night about Boston Light. But jumping ahead to the 1920s and 30s, this guy on the left here, Maurice Babcock, was the keeper from 1926 to 41. Now, for many years, it was called the Lighthouse Service. It was generally referred to as the Lighthouse Service. The keepers were civilian employees of the federal government. It was under the Treasury Department, later under the Commerce Department. The Coast Guard took over lighthouses in this country in 1939. So some of the civilian keepers joined the Coast Guard at that time, others didn't. Some retired as civilians. That's what Maurice Babcock did. He retired as a civilian in 1941. During that time, when he was keeper, especially the 30s and early 40s, there were 3 families, 3 keepers, a head keeper and 2 assistants living at Boston Light. 19 kids among them in 2 houses, a duplex house and another house. 19 kids living on a tiny little 1-acre island. So it's quite an interesting time. And for that reason, it's probably my favorite part of the history of Boston Light. This is a video clip on the right here. This is Maurice Babcock Jr. And I interviewed him in 1988 at his home in Maine. The video quality isn't great, but I'm going to play this clip for you. I think the sound's going to be soft, so I'm going to turn it up. So this is Maurice Babcock Jr. talking about the sort of how the kids at that time at Boston Light made their own fun. They had no choice living on an island like that. They had to make their own fun. So here we go.
Just like?
Let me try that just a second. Still a little soft. Let me see if I can get it louder. I just actually added this clip to the presentation today for the first time, so you're the first people to see this in a really long time. So let me try it again.
I don't know, it's just,
Yeah.
we just liked it.
In the Globe article, you said something that mentioned how you used to go to Great Brewster Island to play ball.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That was the bigger island across there. We had baseball games out there. In the water was out. There were a lot of kids on the other islands during the summer. Summer people used to lease land and build cottages. And then there's quite a few children on Boston Light. And during the summer months, we all played together as one big gang. We had rowing races and baseball games and bonfires, and it was just one day after another. So many things to do, but there wasn't enough time to do them.
So that gives you an idea. You know, again, they had no choice but to find ways to have fun. I should make it clear that the kids at that time only lived at Boston Light during the summer and during school vacations. They boarded with families in Hull, the towns of Hull or Winthrop, on each north and south of the island during the school year, so they could attend school. They loved their summers at Boston Light. This guy on the left here with his wife, that's Ralph Norwood and his wife Josephine. Ralph Norwood was an assistant keeper under Maurice Babcock, and then he joined the Coast Guard in 1939 when the Coast Guard took over, Ralph Norwood. And in 1941, when Babcock retired, Ralph Norwood became the first Coast Guard keeper of Boston Light. He and his wife Josephine had 9 kids, and there they all are. By the time Josephine was 27, they had 9 kids. I think she deserved some kind of medal, but anyway. Again, I interviewed some of these Norwood kids when they were older, and they pretty much all loved their summers out there at Boston Light, doing all the things that Maurice Babcock was talking about. Maurice Babcock Jr. told me that the families got along pretty well, except one time He wandered onto the Norwoods part of the island without permission, and one of the Norwood girls socked him in the nose, he said. But mostly they got along fine. And I want to tell you about the first child born at Boston Light, Georgia Norwood, born to Ralph and Josephine Norwood in 1932. When she was due to be born in April of 1932, there was a big storm. And Josephine Norwood appeared to go into labor. So a doctor was called from the town of Hull, and the doctor braved this storm, high seas, and I guess it was raining really hard. The doctor braved the storm to come in a small boat from Hull to Little Brewster Island. When he got there, it turned out to be false labor. So the baby was not born then, but all the same, it made newspaper headlines, and because of that, even though Georgia was born a week later in calm weather, she got the nickname Storm Child because of the doctor going out there in the storm. So a novelist, I don't know what else she wrote, but I guess she had written some other books before this. A novelist named Ruth Carman wrote this book, Storm Child. It's a little hard to see, but there's an outline and like a silhouette of the lighthouse here. She supposedly based this book on the true story of Georgia Norwood, but it's, when I say loosely based, I mean really loosely. In fact, the climax of the book has Boston Light being destroyed by a tidal wave, so that never happened. Other than her being born there, it's pretty much all made up. But some Hollywood producer types felt that this would make a good movie. They decided they were going to make a movie of Storm Child, and they decided that Georgia Norwood would play herself. And Press Materials billed her as the Bay State's own Shirley Temple. Kind of looks like Shirley Temple there. And she was about to fly out to Hollywood to make the movie. And the story goes that like the night before she was supposed to fly to California, little Georgia, she was I think 5 at the time, started crying, and she said, "I don't want to go to Hollywood. I want to stay at Boston Light." So her mother or her parents decided not to send her to Hollywood. They thought it was a bad idea to kind of split up the family. And she never went, and the movie was never made, which may or may not be a good thing. I don't know. I wish the movie was made. That would have been fun. But anyway, her son, by the way, a guy named Willie Emerson, self-published a book some years ago called First Light about his family's experiences at Boston Light. It's hard to find, but if you can find a used copy of it, I recommend it. It's fun. There's so much more I could talk about with Boston Light, but I got to move on here. So this is a French phrase, and even though I have a French last name, pardon my bad pronunciation, enfer et paradis, basically means hell and heaven. And it's a phrase that's used often in the French lighthouse service to refer to the two basic kinds of lighthouses. You have on one hand the paradise or heaven side of things, which would be a lighthouse on the mainland or on a large island with a lot of land around it. A station like, so you could actually drive to your home, or in the case of the larger island, maybe not, but easier access and some land that you could use to maybe have a big vegetable garden, maybe have animals, cows and chickens were common. And also at the ones that had nice comfortable keepers' houses in those kinds of locations, there were family stations, so the keeper got to live there with his family. On the other side of the equation, you had the enfer or hell side of things, and that would be a lighthouse out in the water somewhere, an offshore lighthouse, maybe stuck on a rock or completely surrounded by water, and no land at all. Obviously, just boat access and often difficult access in rough seas, and they were not family stations for the most part. Early on, some of them were. I'm going to talk about that, but mostly they were so-called stag stations, males only. Families who lived there with them. So keepers at the offshore, the rougher stations were actually paid a bit more, but that was the only plus side of it. Other than that, it was a very difficult way of life, and the two types of lighthouses were very different. I always tell people lighthouse keeping wasn't as romantic as you think, but especially at the offshore remote lighthouses. And probably the most famous offshore lighthouse in America, or certainly one of them, is Minot Ledge Light off the south side of Boston Harbor near Cohasset and Scituate. This film here was taken by the late historian Edward Rowe Snow, and this gentleman here, right here, was talking to me about Edward Rowe Snow before I started speaking tonight. And I don't know if this is the same film he showed you. You were saying he showed you a picture or film of a big wave at Minot Light, but anyway, he took this circa 1940s, and that lighthouse is 114 feet tall, so the film gives you an idea of what a battering it takes pretty often. It's not that unusual to see waves go over the top of it. And it's a granite tower. That wave right there, I think, goes over the top, 114 feet. So it's amazing that it's stood since 1860, but this is the second lighthouse in that location. This one is properly built out of granite blocks, but the first lighthouse at Minot's Ledge was not so properly built. This lighthouse was built 1849. It went into service in early 1850, and you know, it's amazing. It's almost funny to look at this and to think that they thought this could stand through the kind of storms that place is subject to. But there were towers in other parts of the world that stood for long periods of time that were kind of similar to this. So it wasn't a totally insane idea. The thing was, our government was all about saving money in those days. Our lighthouse establishment didn't want to spend proper money on lighthouses until 1852 when they formed a new lighthouse board, and things improved a lot. But before that, it was under the Treasury Department, and there was a man named Stephen Pleasanton, the Treasury official, who was in charge of our lighthouses, and his job was to save money, basically. So we didn't want to spend the money that, say, England and France were spending on their lighthouses, so we lagged behind during that period.
So what was supporting it? There is a ledge there.
There is a ledge.
What was it standing on?
It's standing on a rock, which is actually underwater at high tide.
Right.
So Midas Ledge is part of a series of rocks out there offshore from Cohasset and Scituate called the Cohasset Rocks.
Yeah.
And there were many shipwrecks there over the years, and that's why people felt they needed a lighthouse in this vicinity to warn vessels from going too close to the rocks. So it was a very difficult place to build a lighthouse. The man who designed this, Captain William Swift, said that these iron pilings, you know, that were drilled into the rock, he claimed that the waves would wash right through those legs and not do any damage. And he said it will last for the ages. The keepers lived in 2 floors in this wooden part up here. They actually lived inside there.
Wooden?
Yeah.
Wooden.
Wooden. The upper part is wooden. The pilings are iron. So, I wish I had a happier story to tell you about this, but I don't. Otherwise, I might not be talking about it. But anyway, the first keeper who went to live here in early 1850 was Isaac Dunham. Here's another drawing of the lighthouse in rough seas. This is Isaac Dunham, the first keeper. He was also first keeper at Pembroke Point Light in Maine. Some of you probably know that one. He was also first keeper at what were called the Three Sisters lighthouses in Eastham on Cape Cod. So he was first keeper at 3 famous light stations. But anyway, his son was one of his assistants. He had 2 assistants, and there would always be 2 of them out there at a time. And almost right from the start, he complained to the government that the place shook in storms. He said sometimes in storms it swayed 2 feet in each direction. And he said this place isn't going to last. He insisted they had to build something better, or at least do everything they could to shore up that tower. They did repairs, but they didn't do anything really major. Basically, every time there was a storm, the joints in the legs would loosen and they'd tighten them up again and that kind of thing. But basically, nothing was done. I don't know, I always hesitate about this one story, but I'll tell it anyway. Isaac Dunham had brought a pet cat out to the lighthouse, and he said the cat became so agitated as the tower was swaying, running around in the keeper's quarters up there, that it actually jumped out an open door into the waves below. So, like I said, I hesitate. It's not a very happy story, but it gives you an idea how crazy it was there. After a year, he and his son both quit because they feared for their lives. So the next keeper was a man from England, Captain John Bennett, a very experienced seaman, and he felt at first, he was very confident. He thought this, you know, he said, oh, this guy's a baby or whatever, you know, this thing's gonna stand forever. But soon after that, he thought differently. And he started complaining to the government too that the lighthouse wasn't safe. There was a big storm in March of 1851 that did quite a bit of damage out there. It actually badly damaged their boat. So John Bennett went into Boston to get a new boat in April. And while he was gone, he left 2 young assistant keepers in charge, Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson. They were both in their 20s. Antoine was from Portugal, Wilson was from England. And so they were left in charge, and while they were there, a huge storm came in, much like we're getting right now. Probably a lot worse than this.
Yeah.
But anyway, a big storm came into the Boston area. Houses were washed off islands in Boston Harbor. There were a few deaths in the storm, a few shipwrecks and so forth. So it was a really, really major storm. These 2 young guys are in charge out there, and that night, people living on shore in Cohasset and Scituate that could normally see that light from their homes, they saw the light into the late night that night, the night of the storm. And then the light was out. And then a bit after midnight, they heard the frantic ringing of the fog bell for a period of time, a fairly brief period of time, like a couple of minutes. And it's unclear whether the 2 keepers were sounding the fog bell as an emergency signal, or whether it was swaying back and forth so fast that it was causing the bell to sound over and over again. In any case, soon there was silence, there was no light. John Bennett, of course, was on shore. He couldn't get back in the storm, so he went to shore about 4 a.m. in Cohasset and actually saw pieces of the lighthouse washing up on shore, and some articles of his own clothing. So he knew, beyond any doubt what had happened. The two keepers actually threw a bottle with a note in it in the waves during the storm. They said the lighthouse won't stand through the night. That was picked up by a Gloucester fisherman the next day. The bodies of the two young keepers were later found. They apparently tried to swim to shore, and they apparently died of exposure. One of them was found on a small island nearby. The other one was found at Nantasket Beach in Hull. So it's another, I don't mean to bring you down with these tragic stories, but it's important to remember that some of these keepers made great sacrifices, for the cause of navigation. Here's an artist's idea of what happened that night. Basically, the legs started snapping and the central support eventually gave way. And the keepers apparently stayed in it right to the last, what they were able to figure out. So when the authorities went out to the ledge, that's all that was left, a few bent pilings. The government didn't make a decision right away. For a while, they sent out a lightship to be in the vicinity, basically a floating lighthouse to mark the area. And then it was decided that a new granite lighthouse, which should have been built in the first place, a proper granite lighthouse would be built. And the funds were appropriated in the mid-1850s, and it took 5 years to build this lighthouse, which is a long time, obviously. The thing about the construction there is they could only take place at low tide. Because the ledge is submerged at high tide, they can only build for a few hours every day around low tide. It was built of 1,079 blocks of Quincy granite. Quincy, one of the places known for fine granite. And the blocks were cut, prepared in Quincy, and then shipped to Government Island, which is where these pictures are in Cohasset, where they assembled the blocks and made sure they fit together properly and everything before they brought them out to the ledge. The blocks were actually dovetailed together, and some of them you can kind of see like notches on them. So they sort of fit like puzzle pieces into each other. And they call that dovetailing, and that's the tradition of Eddystone Light in England and other great wave-swept lighthouses in the world. So they're hooked into each other, they're held together with iron dowels and plenty of strong mortar. So this lighthouse was built to last. And again, it took 5 years. All the workers were required to be good swimmers. They always had a lifeguard on duty. And amazingly, in 5 years, nobody was seriously injured or died building this lighthouse. I think that's pretty remarkable. It's officially an American civil engineering landmark. I think it's the only lighthouse that is, I'm pretty sure. But and another interesting side thing about this lighthouse, it's for sale right now. It's for sale at online auction. To make a long story short, the government basically is gradually getting out of the business of taking care of these historic structures. So they're trying to find new owners, like suitable nonprofits or community governments, to take them over. Under this program, if they don't get any good applicants, they're auctioning them to the general public. So a lot of these remote offshore lighthouses have been auctioned in recent years. This is one of 3 that's up for auction right now. Boone Island Light, 6 miles offshore from southern Maine, tallest lighthouse in New England, is currently up for auction. And Halfway Rock Light, 5 miles out from Portland Harbor out in Casco Bay, is currently up for auction. Nobody has bid yet on Minot's Light. It's been up for auction for about a month, and nobody has placed a single bid. And to me, it's one of the most historic buildings in America, but I completely understand why nobody wants to bid on it. What do you do with it? And it's very difficult and dangerous to access. It's going to cost a lot to maintain over time. So, yeah, yes.
Is that a livable?
You can live. I mean, the keepers lived inside
The
it.
keepers did live in it.
Yeah, I haven't actually really talked about that yet, but I was just going to go to this to show you some scenes of life at Minot's Light. The keepers did live inside, so whoever buys it, in theory, could use it as a part-time residence, but obviously there's no running water, there's limited electricity, you have to have a generator or something, and no sewage system, of course, of any kind, anything like that, so it's difficult. Life at a lighthouse like this was not for everybody. This was always a males-only station. They had 2 keepers' houses on shore at Government Island, and the families of the keepers lived there, and they had 3 keepers assigned. 2 would be out at the lighthouse all the time. They might have like 2 weeks on and a week off, and when they were off, they went to the houses at Government Island. So basically they were spending at least 2/3 of their life out of this lighthouse, the keepers. And if you had any kind of depression or mental illness, or everybody wasn't suited to this kind of life. The one keeper quit because he said he couldn't stand around walls anymore. I've seen reference to a suicide attempt, but I haven't found any details on it. But there were certainly lighthouses like this where keepers committed suicide or tried or attacked each other. If you were stuck out in a lighthouse like this with one other guy for a period of weeks at a time, you better get along, you know, in the winter especially, when there was nothing to do but stare at the other guy or whatever. So, you know, they didn't get along, there was trouble. I'm actually going to talk about a story like that in a minute. Here's Edward Gross Snow, and this is, he was, I'm sure a lot of you in this room remember Edward Gross Snow, very popular historian of the New England coast. He lived in Winthrop, Mass. most of his life, and later Marshfield on the South Shore, and he wrote over 40 books. He lectured around the area. He was on radio and TV all the time when I was growing up in Lynn in the 60s. And I blame him for getting me into this mess, you know. He got me interested in maritime history when I was a kid. I got to meet him a couple of times. His daughter's a good friend, and later I got to edit and annotate 7 new editions of his books. He took this picture circa 1940 or 41, I think it was. Again, don't forget that lighthouse is 114 feet tall, so he was also a really good photographer. But among all the other stuff that he did, he also brought tours to strange places like Minot's Light. And I'm going to play you a clip here. This is a silent clip. This is circa 1940. I'll get it to play. There it goes. Circa 1940, and you're going to see Edward Gross Snow, there they go, bringing a group of 100 people to this lighthouse. I'll bet that this is the most people that have ever been at that lighthouse at one time. And in parts of the clip, you'll see a Coast Guard keeper greeting them in the doorway. It's about 65 feet up the ladder to the doorway. You've got women in dresses and probably not the most sensible shoes. And I think some of the men are wearing ties. That's him, that's Edward Gross Snow there. He was a very athletic guy. He was a great swimmer and diver. And he was pretty brave, and he apparently inspired a lot of other people to be brave too. I can't imagine anything like this happening now. There is. There is a fine line between brave and stupid. So I'm sure these people had a great time, but to me it's scary. So anyway, if you buy this lighthouse at auction, you can have all your friends over. And you can reenact this. Look at that. I don't think there's ever been a scene like that there before or since. I mean, before or after. Yeah, he's barefoot. So, coming out and starting down the ladder would be a scary part of it, yeah. I mean, those are not big rungs on that ladder, so they're not wide or anything.
We having fun. Look at that.
Okay, that's the end of that. So, I just threw that into the talk today, actually, because I thought you'd enjoy seeing that, especially since I'm sure some of you remember him. This is another clip. This is 1962. It's on Edward Gross Snow's 60th birthday, and this is something he did a few times in his life, but nobody knew he was going to do it on his 60th birthday. I'll go ahead and play this for you. You have to watch carefully. He climbs up the ladder. And that's about 65 feet above the water, that doorway. And watch carefully. Not the greatest quality here, but watch carefully. There he goes.
Onto the ledge. Is there a ledge under there?
There's all rocks around there, but he knew where the deeper water was, so he knew where to land. His daughter, Dolly, was just inside the doorway when he did that. She didn't know he was going to do it. She said all of a sudden he did like a Tarzan yell and he jumps out. And she said, that's when I knew my father was crazy. But she means that in a good way. So I could talk about Edward Gross Snow for a long time, but I want to move on here. I'm jumping up to Maine here. Saddleback Ledge Light, which is a wave-swept lighthouse in East Penobscot Bay. Actually, it was on a cruise just this past Saturday that I went near it. And it's much shorter than Minot's Light, but it's a very sturdy granite tower. And it was actually designed by a very prominent architect, Alexander Paris, who built the Quincy Market buildings in Boston. So it's very well built, but it's not very tall. And the amazing thing about this lighthouse is that when it was first built, the government thought it would be a good idea to have a keeper and his family living inside that lighthouse. So there was later they added this attached building with a couple more rooms to give a little more room for the people living there, but at first it was just inside the lighthouse, 2 rooms and a cellar. This man, Watson Y. Hopkins, was the first keeper. That's a painting of him that was sent to me by a descendant of his. And he, in 1840, well, before I tell you that, I'll tell you that he and his wife had 6 kids when they moved into the lighthouse. His wife had a baby a few months later in the lighthouse. So you had a family of 9, including an infant, living inside a granite lighthouse a few miles offshore from the nearest point of land, and 2 rooms and a cellar, and at first an outdoor privy, which, as he tells in this letter, was actually washed away in a storm. And it's just, it's mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And they lived there for 10 years. The person who sent me this painting said it was family legend that just after the baby was born at the lighthouse, that a boat came up to pick up the mother and the baby, and they were handing the baby to somebody on the boat, and the baby was dropped into the ocean. But someone was able to pluck the baby out quickly and out of the very cold water, and the baby survived. It was okay. And she grew up. She lived to be 86 and was a very prominent resident of Vinalhaven. So, but this is part of a letter that he wrote in 1843 to the government for a report on lighthouses, and he said, I was appointed keeper of this light upon a salary of $450 a year. That's a year. I live with my family in the tower, which is the only building on the ledge. I'm obliged to bring my water from shore a distance of 7 miles. He had to row a dory, a small boat, 7 miles each way to get water for his family. We're badly off for room to stow wood and provisions. I've been allowed a boat. She's entirely unfit for this place, being nothing more than a small dory. My family consists of 9 persons. The iron railing, which was secured to the rock around the tower, has been swept away. Also the privy, carried away the first storm after its erection. The windows all leak in storms, and it goes on for a while. That's just the top of the iceberg. There was a lot more. And it's absolutely incredible. I just, when I saw this lighthouse on Saturday and I was narrating a cruise about it, you know, people were gasping on the boat when I told these stories. So. But eventually they did mercifully make it a males only stag station. They took the family off of there, and they added this building, this combination boathouse and a couple of rooms upstairs. So it was never luxury living, but it made it a little bit better. The wooden building, I think, it was still there like in the 1960s. It hasn't been that long. I think it was maybe the 60s when it was torn down. So this is another pretty much wave-swept lighthouse at the entrance to Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, the entrance to the west passage of the bay. It's not too far from Jamestown and Narragansett. If you go to Beavertail Light, some of you have probably been there, and you look out the distance, you can see the wreckage of the base of this lighthouse. The lighthouse is gone now. It was destroyed in the hurricane of 1938. And this is not the main story I want to tell you, but I do want to mention it was wiped out in the hurricane. There are still pieces of the lighthouse underwater. The keeper who was there in the hurricane, 40-year-old man named Walter Everly, was never found. He was one of 7 people who died at lighthouses in New England during that hurricane. I'm going to talk more about the hurricane in a few minutes. But the story I want to tell you right now is in 1897, the head keeper was Judson Allen, and he had 2 assistants, and there would always be 2 men out there at a time. It was a stag station. The families didn't live there. So Judson Allen was out there with the assistant, Henry Nygren. And I should also mention that this is a lighthouse that some people sometimes call a spark plug type light, because it kind of looks like a spark plug. The caisson is bolted to the rock and filled with concrete to anchor it, and then this cast iron superstructure is built on top. Often these caissons are sunk down underwater into the bottom. A lot of them are just placed on the bottom. But anyway, so Judson Allen and Henry Nygren were there, 1897. They had a long-running feud. I'm not sure how it started, but they apparently hated each other. Judson Allen was lighting the light at sunset one night, and suddenly Nygren appeared in the lantern and came charging at him with a knife. And Allen was able to, even though Nygren was a much bigger man, he was able to knock the knife out of Nygren's hand. They were wrestling for a while. The knife went bouncing down the stairs. Nygren went after it. While Nygren was going after the knife, Allen went outside, up here on the lantern level, and there was rope there, I guess, and he was able to lower himself by rope down the side of the lighthouse to one of the station's 2 boats, got the boat in the water, and started rowing for all he was worth, for shore. Nygren, meanwhile, grabbed a shotgun and fired shots at Allen, and was screaming, "I'm going to kill you," and screaming all kinds of stuff, I'm sure. Allen just kept rowing for shore, and Nygren got the other boat, started rowing after him, still screaming at him. Allen made it to shore, found a horse, and rode to the nearest house, and told the people what was happening. Meanwhile, Nygren turned around, went back to the lighthouse. So authorities were alerted, and they got 2 men from a local life-saving station to go out to the lighthouse to apprehend Nygren. And they said that when they got there, Nygren was at the top of the lighthouse, dancing wildly and throwing utensils and plates off the top of the lighthouse, they said. So very wisely, I think they decided to wait till morning, let him sleep it off for a while. and in the morning he was apprehended and taken into the authorities. I don't know if he ever went to prison, but obviously his lighthouse keeping career was over. So it's an extreme example, but there was another very similar story that happened at a lighthouse in Connecticut, Stratford Shoal Light. I've run into these types of stories a few times. Again, it wasn't for everybody, life at these offshore lighthouses. And this guy, Alan said he drank Niagara and drank a lot. He was, apparently had an alcohol problem. Any sorts of problems like that were going to be exacerbated by life at a place like this. I want to tell you a little bit about a couple of women keepers. This is a subject that could easily be its own lecture, but this is Matinicus Rock. There are 2 lighthouses there. This is another lighthouse I just saw on Saturday on the cruise I was on. It's over 20 miles from the mainland, about 5 miles from the larger island of Matinicus. But in other words, it's in the middle of nowhere, off mid-coast Maine, way out on the entrance to Penobscot Bay. And there used to be 2 lighthouses. One is still active, the other one had its lantern taken off. The reason I'm showing you this is that there was a woman there who is one of the most famous women in American lighthouse history. Some of you may know the children's book, Keep the Lights Burning, Abby. Yeah, this is the only known photograph of Abby Burgess right here, Abby Burgess Grant. She was the daughter of Keeper Samuel Burgess at Matinicus Rock, and they moved there in about 1855, and Abby was 16 years old. And she had older siblings, but they were away, and she had a couple of younger siblings. Her mother was an invalid, was very sick at the time, but her father, to make extra money, was often away fishing. And from the time she was 16 years old, Abby learned to care for the lights, the 2 lights there. She learned to take the proper ways of taking care of the oil lamps and doing everything else that a lighthouse keeper had to do. One day in January 1856, Abby was still 16 years old. Her father had to go away. He was planning to be away for maybe 2 or 3 days to get supplies. And he told Abby that she was going to be in charge of the lighthouses and her mother and her younger siblings. And the last thing he said was, "I can depend on you, Abby." And then he went away. After he went away, a big storm came in, and there were very, very high seas. To make a long story, I want to tell you about that particular storm, but to jump ahead a little bit, it turned out there was a series of storms over about a month, 4 weeks. Those seas were so rough during that period that her father was not able to return for 4 weeks. And during that time, the lights never went out. The 2 lights, she kept them burning all night and took care of her invalid mother and her younger siblings. And it's just amazing. During that first storm, the island was virtually underwater. The waves were going over the entire island during that first storm. This is part of a letter she wrote to a friend. She said, as the tide came, the sea rose higher and higher, till the only endurable places were the light towers. If they stood, we were saved. Otherwise, our fate was only too certain. But for some reason, I know not why, I had no misgivings and went on with my work as usual. So she, at the height of the storm, when the island was virtually underwater, the house was flooded. So she had to move her mother and her younger siblings into one of the lighthouse towers in higher ground. Until the sea subsided. She also rescued her chickens from the waves, and that's actually what's happening in this drawing here. I think one of them was lost, but otherwise she rescued all her chickens. It's astounding, and she was written up in national publications. She was regarded as a national heroine. And later on, the man who replaced her father as keeper was John Grant, and the Burgesses stayed on to help train the Grant family. John Grant's son, Isaac, was an assistant. And Isaac Grant and Abby Burgess developed a romance. They ended up getting married. She stayed on Matinicus Rock as an assistant keeper. Eventually, Isaac, her husband, became the head keeper at Matinicus Rock, and Abby was an assistant keeper. Later, they both moved to Whitehead Island in Penobscot Bay, and Isaac was the head keeper, and Abby was an assistant. So early on, she did the work without the pay, but eventually she did get the title and the pay. So she's certainly one of the most famous women in lighthouse history. She only lived to be 53. Shortly before she died, she wrote a letter to a friend, and she said, "I wonder if the care of the lighthouse will follow my soul after it has left this worn-out body. If I ever have a gravestone, I'd like it to be in the form of a lighthouse or beacon." She did not get that at first. She just got this little gravestone in a little cemetery in Spruce Head, Maine. But in the 1940s, Edward Rowe Snow, on the right here, and his cousin Wilbert Snow, who was a renowned poet, briefly governor of Connecticut, actually. The 2 of them had this little metal lighthouse made by a sculptor, and they had a gathering there at her graveside, and they put the lighthouse on the grave, and it's still there. And it's been recently restored by the American Lighthouse Foundation. Took me a couple of trips there to find it. It's a tiny little cemetery. Have you been there? Tiny little, yeah, tiny little cemetery between a couple of houses. It took me a while to find it, and when I finally did find it, it was like I think it was in July, and I got eaten alive by mosquitoes, but it was worth it. I had to ask people
So
a
is
few
that
times.
lighthouse haunted by her? Was there a story to that? She wanted her soul to stay there?
That's an interesting question. There are ghost stories of Matinicus Rock, but they don't seem to do with her. That the tower that doesn't have a lantern on it anymore, the one that's deactivated, the Coast Guard keepers who were out there in later years claim that you could see a glowing light coming out of the windows of that tower, even though there was no power there of any kind or anything. And I've actually talked to a guy who swears he saw that, and they could not figure it out. They called the ghost Mo. I don't know why, they just decided it was Mo. But I don't know of any stories about Abby Burgess. It's a haunting. This is Ida Lewis, who is probably not only the most famous woman keeper, but the most famous lighthouse keeper in American history at Newport, Rhode Island. It doesn't look like much of a lighthouse here. This is a postcard with Ida sitting in the foreground with her dog there. This is Lime Rock Light. It's still there. It's now a yacht club. And the light is just a small light on the water side of this building. It was an inner harbor light. It didn't need to be a tall lighthouse. It's just a small, basically a small harbor light. Hard to photograph? You have to be in a boat, really, to get a decent photo of it. It was built in the mid-1850s. Ida's father, Hosea Lewis, was the first keeper. So they went out to live there when Ida was a teenager. Similar to Abby Burgess, she learned how to care for the light as a girl. She also became an expert rower of a dory. And she would row her younger siblings to school in Newport, and they say that she became the best dory handler in Newport, which is saying a lot in a place like Newport, a very maritime town. Her father had a stroke when Ida was still a teenager. He was incapacitated, and Ida basically took over the care of the lighthouse. Her mother got the official title of keeper, but never really did the job. So Ida lived there for well over 50 years. She didn't get the official title of keeper until she was middle-aged, but she was doing that job for 50 years or so. And she was credited with the rescue of at least 18 people from drowning while she lived there. Possibly as many as 30, but there were 18 documented rescues. One of my favorite rescues that she did was a time when two young men were escorting a rare sheep along the shore of Newport to the Belmont family, one of the rich families of Newport. The sheep tried to escape by swimming out into the harbor. And they found a little wooden skiff that actually belonged to Ida's brother. They went out in the skiff and it fell apart underneath them, and they couldn't swim and they were struggling in the waves. Ida went out in her dory and plucked them out by the clothes, which is typically what she would do. She was short, she wasn't very big, but she was very strong, and she would pull them out by their clothes, by the collar or whatever, and you drag them into her boat. So she got the two guys and she got them back to the keeper's house. And they said, well, the sheep's still out there. So she looked out and saw the sheep struggling in the waves, and she went out and rescued the sheep, too. So we know she rescued at least 18 people and one sheep. But because there were so many rich and influential people in Newport, they kind of championed her cause. They made her quite famous. She got visited by all kinds of famous people, including President Ulysses Grant and Susan B. Anthony, the suffragist, among other people. She didn't like all that attention. She was shy and retiring and modest, but she got the attention anyway. She got zillions of marriage proposals. She did briefly marry and leave Lime Rock for like a year, and ended up coming back and not wanting to talk about her marriage. The husband was not with her, so we don't know much about that. But there were songs written about her, poems, and they sold Ida Lewis scarves in stores for a while. This became a popular style, that type of scarf like that. So, really one of the big celebrities of the late 1800s, one of the most famous women in the country at the time. Harper's Weekly, leading publication at the time, she made the front page. In 1869, the people of Newport gave her a fancy dory with mahogany seats and gold-plated oarlocks, and they paraded her in the 4th of July parade through the city of Newport. And, she hated every minute of that, I think. She didn't like all that attention, but quite an amazing woman. There's a couple of biographies about her, good books you can read, and also a new documentary that was just finished that is going to be on Rhode Island Public Television, I know, pretty soon. I'm not sure where else it's going to be shown, but you can buy the DVD. It's well worth seeing. When she died in 1911, she was still in her 60s, And when she died, the light at Lime Rock was named for her. They changed the name to the Ida Lewis Light, which is very unusual. I don't know of any other case of that happening. And then not too many years after that, the light was discontinued and they made it into a yacht club. So there's this bigger deck built around it now. There's the light right here. The yacht club still lights the light on summer nights as a tribute to Ida Lewis. And they have exhibits about her inside. I can tell you about more women keepers, believe me, but I'm going to do a couple more subjects here, trying to cover a lot of ground here. Lighthouse menagerie, animals at lighthouses are a favorite topic of mine. I have done a whole lecture on this subject. At a lot of the family stations, if they had the land for it, they would have a cow or chickens, sometimes pigs, sheep, other animals, but typically cows and chickens were the most common. If they had the land, of course, they'd have a big vegetable garden too. So I'm sure some of you have been to Marblehead Light in Marblehead, Mass. That's where this cow is. It's hard to believe when you go there now. The only thing that's there is the lighthouse, and a little oil house and some public restrooms, but this is the keeper's house that used to be there. And they had chicken coops and a cow at that lighthouse. This picture on the right is in what is now Cranes Beach in Ipswich. And I don't know, I know probably a couple of people here know that there was a lighthouse there at one time, but most of you might not know that. It was this lighthouse that was on Cranes Beach in Ipswich was actually dismantled and floated to Martha's Vineyard. Became the Edgartown Lighthouse on Martha's Vineyard. Some of you may have seen it there. That's the same lighthouse, but it was originally in Ipswich, built in about 1881. The guy here is keeper Benjamin Ellsworth feeding his chickens on the beach here. He was there for like 40 years, and I love this picture. This is chickens running around loose on the beach. Reminds me of the story in Newport, Rhode Island. There was a lighthouse that doesn't exist anymore called Gull Rocks, and people in the area for a while in the early 1900s were finding chicken eggs washing up on the local beaches. They couldn't figure it out. It turned out the keeper was letting his chickens roost on the rocks, and at high tide the eggs would get swept away. And of course dogs were common at lighthouses. And this is the old Egg Rock light that was off Nahant. Some of you may know the island Egg Rock, very prominent rocky island there near Nahant and Swampscott and Lynn. This was a dog that belonged to the first keeper named George. The keeper was named George Taylor, and his dog, which I think is the dog in this photo, was Milo, half St. Bernard, half Newfoundland. And Milo became famous as a great swimmer, and he supposedly rescued several children from drowning around the lighthouse. And his fame spread far and wide, and an artist in England who was very popular for his animal portraits named Edwin Henry Landseer, he's still popular, some of you may know him, decided he was going to paint Milo's portrait. And he did. And I'll show you what it looked like. His painting was called Saved. And there's Milo with the child that he supposedly just rescued from the ocean. It always strikes me a little funny. It's like this child doesn't really look so good in this picture. Prints of this were sold far and wide, and it was in many publications. Turns out before I was born, my family had a print of this, a framed print up in the house for a long time. My brother, my older brother, who's 12 years older than me, you know him, Jim, he, as a kid, he said that he would see this and he thought that the dog was going to eat the child. So he was kind of afraid of the painting, but that wasn't the idea at all. The dog is supposedly just rescued the child. The child was posed for by the keeper's son, 4-year-old son, Frank. They dress little boys a little differently in Victorian times. Anyway, so that is probably the most famous painting ever done.
Is that supposed to be a boy? No.
Yeah, it is. It's a boy.
Supposed to be a boy.
Yeah, but they, they did dress. They boys wore dresses a lot in Victorian times. Little boys. Yeah. So this is probably the most famous painting ever done of a lighthouse pet, I would say. This is one of the famous Maine fog dogs, as I like to call them. This is Wood Island Light, which is off Biddeford Pool in southern Maine. Very pretty lighthouse that not all that many people see because it's off on an island offshore, but you can take a boat tour out there. But anyway, this is a keeper named Thomas Orcutt who was there in the early 1900s, and his dog was Sailor. This is the fog bell tower. This tower goes up pretty high from what you see here, and basically when it was foggy out, the keeper would have to go into this tower. He would crank up like a clockwork type machine. Weights would rise up in this tower, and as the weights gradually fell, it drove a hammer that would come out of this slot and would hit the bell every so many seconds. But he could also sound the bell manually by pulling this rope if he wanted to. If he had to suddenly sound it for some reason. So he would do that on occasion, and Sailor, his dog, saw his master, Keeper Orcutt, doing that, and he learned to do it by pulling it with his teeth. And you see the proof right here, he's doing it there. So they say that every time a boat was passing, and not in fog, it could be in a sunny day, but boats got to know Sailor, the local boaters, sailors, fishermen, people like that, and they would sound a bell or a horn as they came by Wood Island Lighthouse, and Sailor would run out. And they say he would pull the rope 3 times and sound the bell 3 times, and that's the best. And then he would bark and jump around and be a very happy dog. So he's one of several famous Maine fog dogs. There was one at Owl's Head Lake in Mid-Coast, Maine, a dog named Spot, and he was credited with saving the mailboat from going aground one time in a snowstorm. They say he was barking like crazy in the house, and the keeper let him outside. He ran out on the rocks, and even though the people couldn't see the boat out in the snow, the dog could, or could sense it or whatever, and the dog just barked furiously at the top of his lungs until the captain of the mailboat steered away just barely in time before he hit the rocks. So there's a children's book called Lighthouse Dog to the Rescue, based on that story. So there are a few famous fog dogs. And there are cats at some of the lighthouses. This is, I'm sure a lot of you know the Noble Light up in York, one of the most visited and most photographed lighthouses in the country. Very, very pretty place. It's a little bit offshore. You go to a park there, Sawyer Park in York. You look at it about 100 feet away across the water. This keeper, Eugene Coleman, was there in the 1930s, and he inherited a cat from a previous keeper. And this 19-pound tabby was named Sambo Tonkus. They say he was also called Mr. T. It was long before the other Mr. T. And Sambo Tonkus became really famous because visitors to the park there would be looking at the lighthouse and they would see this big cat swimming back and forth across the channel like 3 or 4 times a day. Something you don't expect to see. I guess you'd get bored in one place and swim to the other and look for birds or mice or whatever. So he was quite famous. I don't know if he fished, but there were fishing cats at some lighthouses. There was one in Rhode Island at a lighthouse in the Providence River, and they say when the cat was fishing underwater, you'd only see the tail above the water going back and forth. I'll tell you a couple of stories of rescues at Lighthouse. There are so many rescue stories, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. These are the Two Lights at Cape Elizabeth. I'm sure some of you here are familiar with that place. The Two Lights Lobster Shack is right next to there, popular little restaurant. And in this picture, this aerial picture, you can see the 2 lights. There's the east light and the west light here. The west light became a lookout tower in World War II. It's no longer an active lighthouse. This is what the east light looked like early in its history. But it was 2 stone lighthouses, 1828, and then 2 cast iron lighthouses in 1881. And this station, because there were 2 lights and also a steam-driven fog signal, they always had a head keeper and 2 assistant keepers. This man, Marcus Hanna, was the head keeper in the 1880s. He was a son of a lighthouse keeper. He had grown up at lighthouses, and he also was a Civil War hero. He got a Medal of Honor for bravery in the Civil War. He was pinned down by Confederate fire with a company of men, and he braved enemy fire to get water for his men, and got a Medal of Honor from Congress for that. And then he became a lighthouse keeper, and he was at Cape Elizabeth in 1885. His wife was one of his 2 assistant keepers, not unusual. And there was a snowstorm, and he was sick at the time. He had a bad cold, and he had to stay up all night with a bad cold through the snowstorm, shoveling coal into the boiler to keep the foghorn going. Got to bed about 8 a.m. Less than an hour later, his wife woke him up to tell him there was a shipwreck offshore from the fog signal building. And he went out, and he could just barely see it through the snow. There was a schooner, it was called the Australia. It was coming down from Booth Bay Harbor, and it went aground. It hit a shallow area. It was partially sunk. The masts were sticking up above the water. The captain had already been swept away and drowned. 2 crewmen were clinging to the rigging for their lives, just barely hanging on. So Hannah told his wife and the other assistant to go get help. And while they were gone, he got a long length of rope, which he wrapped around himself. There was a weight, like some kind of metal weight at one end of the rope. He went out to the edge of the water, and he kept trying to throw the rope to the men in the rigging. Because it was a little too far away, he was not able to reach them. So he realized he had to get closer. So this is January during a snowstorm in Maine. He waded out into the ocean, waist deep. Waves were lapping over his head. And after a few more tries, he got the rope to one of the 2 men in the rigging. Somehow the man was able to catch it and get the rope around himself, and Hannah pulled the man to shore. And he said he could barely believe the man was alive. Basically, his face was frozen in a grimace. He was barely alive. But he was alive, and he survived. He recovered. And then help arrived, a few neighbors, and with help, they were able to get the rope to the 2nd man, and they pulled him to shore. So they both survived. It was considered miraculous that they rescued those 2 men. And he and his assistant keeper got gold life-saving medals from Congress. And to date, he is the only man in American history to have both a a Medal of Honor in wartime, and a Gold Life-Saving Medal from Congress. And there's another honor. There's a Coast Guard 175-foot buoy tender stationed in South Portland. It's named the Marcus Hanna after him. There's a replica of his life-saving medal on board. One of the so-called keeper's class of buoy tenders. There's another one in the Ida Lewis stationed down in Rhode Island. I want to tell you about a famous wreck at Portland Headlight, another popular lighthouse that I'm sure a lot of you have visited. I think one of the prettiest places anywhere. I took this picture last week, by the way. Such a beautiful place, I never get tired of it. But anyway, this guy, that guy doesn't look like a lighthouse keeper, I don't know if he does. That is Joshua Strout. He was actually the son of a housekeeper of a previous keeper, kind of a coincidence, but Joshua Freeman Strout became keeper of Portland Headlight for 35 years. He was there in 1869 to 1904. And his wife was an assistant under him for a while, and his son here, Joseph, was an assistant to his father, and when his father retired, Joseph became keeper for another 24 years. So this guy lived like 60 years of his life at that lighthouse. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet, used to walk from his home in Portland to visit with the Strouts. That's one interesting thing about their time there. But another interesting thing is the shipwreck that happened in 1886. You don't expect to see a shipwreck right next to a lighthouse like that. That's not supposed to happen. Lighthouse is supposed to help prevent that. But what happened was it was Christmas Eve, 1886. This vessel was called the Annie C. McGuire. It was formerly a clipper ship that had been kind of refitted. It was carrying goods down the coast. And it had 18 people on board, including the captain's wife and son. It was late at night. There was like a sleet storm going on. Joshua Strout was on watch in the lighthouse, and he saw the ship come up onto the rocks. His son Joseph was just going to bed, and Joshua yelled down to his son, "There's a ship in the yard." So they went outside, and Mary Strout, Joshua's wife, soaked blankets in kerosene and set them on fire to illuminate the scene so they could see. Everybody on the ship was able to climb off the ship onto the rocks here, and the Strouts got a ladder across here to these rocks, and everybody was able to climb across the ladder to safety. All 18 people survived, nobody was hurt. Luckily, they were really lucky. If they were going to be wrecked, they might as well be next to a lighthouse where they were able to help them. They were also lucky enough to take part in the Strout family's Christmas dinner of chicken pies, and the Strouts couldn't get rid of them for the next few days because their food was so good. Joseph Strout said later that the crew salvaged a case of rum off the ship. They drank it all and beat up the ship's cook because their food had been so bad on their voyage. They finally got rid of them after they pretty much ran out of food, I guess. And Joseph Strout's son, who was later an assistant keeper when he was something like 21 years old, painted the rock where the shipwreck happened, commemorating it, put a cross on it, which seems odd to me because there was no loss of life in the wreck. But anyway, it's become a tradition to repaint that once in a while. So this is what it looks like now, and if you go to see Portland Headlight today, you'll still see that painted on the rock there. Annie C. McGuire shipwrecked here, Christmas Eve, 1886. And I know it's getting a little late, I haven't got too much more to go, but I want to tell you one story here that kind of falls under the heading of both tragedy and triumph. This is Palmer's Island Light in New Bedford, Mass, and it's a small stone lighthouse, what they call rubble stone, just built of the stone that's found on the site there. It's built in 1849 during the heyday of New Bedford as the leading whaling port in the country. New Bedford was one of the richest cities in the world at that time. Hard to believe now, but it was. But anyway, so this lighthouse is kind of representative of that era in New Bedford. This man, Arthur Small, became keeper at Palmer's Island in 1922. He was one of 3 lighthouse keeper brothers, and he was also a great artist. He was a very well-respected keeper, but you can see how beautiful his paintings were. This is a watercolor, and he did, I think, mostly oils. Not only is his work pretty, but it was always completely accurate. The rigging and the sails in his paintings was always perfect, and he was really a highly regarded maritime artist. So he and his wife Mabel went to live at this lighthouse in 1922, along with some cats, as you can see. And they had been there 16 years when the hurricane of 1938 came along. You can see in this picture how low-lying the whole island is at the entrance to New Bedford Harbor there on the Acushnet River. I mean, just look how low it is. It basically looks like a disaster waiting to happen. Of course, when the hurricane of 38 happened, September 21st, nobody knew it was coming. Some of you probably know that there was no warning. The Weather Service thought that the storm was going out to sea, so they didn't warn anybody. So people saw it getting dark. They thought a storm was coming, but they didn't know it was a hurricane. So Arthur Small saw the skies getting really dark in the afternoon. He thought he better light the light early because it was so dark. He went out in the afternoon and was walking out on the walkway to the lighthouse, and the waves by that time were coming way up on the island. A wave knocked him down. He hit his head and was actually briefly unconscious. One version I read said that he actually was underwater and had to swim back to shore. So but different versions seem to vary a little bit. But anyway, his wife Mabel was watching this from back here somewhere, and she thought she had to go to the aid of her husband. So she went to the boathouse, it's over here, and tried to launch the station's boat to go help her husband. As she was doing that, and Arthur Small was awake by this time and saw what happened, as she was trying to launch the boat, a gigantic wave came over the island, and that was the last time he ever saw his wife. She basically disappeared in the wave. Arthur Small, in spite of what happened, in spite of seeing what happened to his wife, and in spite of being injured himself, hitting his head, he basically crawled to the lighthouse and went up to the top. He was found the next morning by people from shore who were checking up to see what happened there. They found him at the top in the lantern with the light on. It had been on all night, and he was unconscious. But he had kept the light going. That was his job. That's what you did if you were a lighthouse keeper. You kept that light going no matter what. He was taken to medical facilities. His wife's body was later found. She had had their life savings on her of $700. That was gone. The house was wiped out. Everything was wiped off the island except the lighthouse tower by the storm. Many of his paintings were in the house. So, obviously a terrible loss in many ways for him. An interesting note on this is that he had a friend, a lighthouse keeper named George Gustavus, who was a keeper at Prudence Island Lighthouse in Rhode Island during the Hurricane of '38. George Gustavus and his wife and one of their sons and 3 other people were in the keeper's house at Prudence Island during the storm. The house was basically washed out to sea. Gustavus, the keeper, was pushed back by another wave and was rescued by somebody. He was the only one who survived who had been in the house. So his wife died. Arthur Small and George Gustavus were friends. Both of their wives were named Mabel. They both died in the hurricane. And the 2 guys, Arthur Small and George Gustavus, recovered in adjacent beds in the Chelsea Naval Hospital. So just kind of an interesting side note there. Arthur Small finished his career at Beverly, Mass. Hospital Point Light, and then retired. And he is the only lighthouse keeper, as far as I know, to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. When this happened after the hurricane of '38, the commissioner of lighthouses called it the most incredible show of loyalty and devotion in the history of the lighthouse service. And it's hard to argue with that. So it's a sad story, but I think it's also an inspirational story. And I'm almost done, but I got one more little topic here for you. Here are some pictures of lighthouse lenses over the years, and you can see how they've changed. For many years, these Fresnel lenses, so-called because they're named by the inventor, Augustin Jean Fresnel, French scientist in 1822. They're beautiful. People call them the jewels of the lighthouse, made of multiple prisms that basically concentrate and focus the light into a powerful beam. Most of those are gone from lighthouses. Some of them were destroyed, some of them are in museums. This one's in a museum in Kittery, Maine. Only maybe 10% of lighthouses still have them. Almost none of the offshore lighthouses have them because they're too expensive to maintain. Some lighthouses got these rotating aero beacons a little later on. Portland Head still has aero beacons like that. Beavertail Light in Rhode Island. Similar to lights they use at airports, and still got the Fresnel principle. They still have prisms, basically, that help concentrate the light. But those have mostly been phased out by other lights. This is called the VRB-25. It's a little rotating plastic light made by the Vega company in New Zealand. And for a while, those became the most popular for flashing lights offshore, rotating plastic light that produced a flash. But many of these have been phased out by these LED lights. This is an array of LEDs. They can stack them into various levels depending on how bright they want the light to be. The LED lights are all solar powered. Almost all our offshore lighthouses are now solar powered. It's a lot easier and cheaper in the long run than underwater cables, and also better for the environment, of course. So these days, a lot of the offshore lights, when you look out and you see them flashing, not all lights have flash, not all lighthouses are flashing, but a lot of them are. When you see that some of these flashes, they have this sort of bluish tint that LED lights have. You know how the new car headlights are sort of bluish? Same with the lighthouses. A lot of them with the old Fresnel lenses or the rotating arrow beacons, they would have a beautiful, warm, yellowish sweep on the water. Now it's like blink, blink, you know, little bluish light. So that's progress for you, I guess. The Coast Guard basically has been trying to, they're always updating to what they consider the best light for the least amount of taxpayer money. So you can't blame them for that, but I think it's kind of sad, but I hope they leave some of the Fresnel lenses in some of the lighthouses. There's not many anymore. Portsmouth Harbor Light.
Still has it.
Nobska, yeah,
Still has
your
a
favorite,
Fresnel
yeah.
lens.
Cape Cod still has a fourth order Fresnel lens. So there's still some in place, but again, it's kind of an endangered species. One more note about Boston Light. In the late 80s, all the lights were automated. Boston Light was due to be the last lighthouse in the country to be automated. They were going to do it in 1989. Dennis Dever here on the left was the Coast Guard officer in charge there. Looked like he was going to be America's last lighthouse keeper. He loved that role. He really enjoyed being a lighthouse keeper. I want to play you a quick clip here of Dennis talking in 1988 at the top of the lighthouse.
It's a nice environment in the evening when the wind's howling, the snow's flying, and the sea's roaring against the rocks outside your window. Just to sit there in the living room, maybe read Edgar Allan Poe book or something like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
So I think he's still, I don't think he's retired yet. He's had a pretty long career in the Coast Guard. Great guy. I get to know him pretty well. I was giving tours of Boston Light around that time. That's how I first really got into lighthouses in the late 80s. But as it turned out, they didn't automate the light in '89. People were afraid if they removed the Coast Guard staff that the place would fall to ruin, it would be abandoned, and there'd be vandalism and that sort of thing. So legislation was passed, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, to keep the Coast Guard at Boston Light. That was passed in '89, and so they kept the Coast Guard crew out there, but then in more recent years they didn't want to keep full duty personnel out there because they have other uses for them, obviously. So they decided to hire a civilian keeper about 10 years ago, Sally Snowman, and that is how she pronounces her name. This is Sally right here. She's been the keeper now at Boston Light for about 10 years. And she is our only official lighthouse keeper in the United States. And she makes her own costumes, as you can see there. She's standing by the beautiful second order, which means second to the biggest kind, Fresnel lens there. You see the round panels that create a flash as the lens revolves around the light. Her job is more about giving tours and administration and that kind of thing. The light is on 24 hours a day, it's automated, but I'm not downplaying what she does. She's our only official lighthouse keeper still employed by the federal government. Boston Light in 2016 is going to celebrate its 300th anniversary. They are currently renovating all the buildings, so there are no tours there this summer. They're going to resume public tours next season. I recommend that you go there. It's a wonderful place to visit and take tours from the Boston waterfront. But it closed for this year. There's a scaffolding around the lighthouse right now. And one more quick thing, Connie Small was an amazing person. She and her husband, Elson Small, lived at lighthouses for 28 years. For 26 years, they lived on islands off the Maine coast. Then they moved to Portsmouth Harbor Light in Newcastle, New Hampshire, which you see here, in 1946. It was the first place they lived where they didn't have to take a boat to get to their home. They could actually drive to their home. Also the first place they ever lived that had electricity. Elson Small retired in 1948. He died in 1960, but Connie went on to write a wonderful book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife, which I very highly recommend. If you want to read about what it was like to live at lighthouses, get a copy of Connie Small's book, The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife. And I got to know Connie in her later years. I used to visit her at the nursing home where she lived in Portsmouth. She lived to be 103. She died in early 2005 at 103. So I interviewed her on video when she was 96, and I'm going to play you a brief clip here of her at the age of 96 talking about having electricity for the first time at Portsmouth Harbor Light.
We always look forward to electricity, of course, and the first electricity was when we came to Portsmouth Harbor. And of course he said, well, we'll go up and light the light. So we went up, and finally he said, press the button, and I pressed the button, and I had no more feeling, and I've got it right now. And I thought, what has happened? What is the reason? So I went down to the kitchen, sat down, and began to think about it. What in the world, why wasn't I? When we look forward to it as a big thing, then I realized we had to give 20 minutes of ourselves to light that light. And we had put part of us into it. And that made it something. But just to press the button, that was nothing. You see what I mean? And so that's my first, but when I went back and went in the house and saw what I could do, we went on an electric binge. Bought everything we could electric.
So, I love sharing that because Connie is such a sweet person, and you know, but it also it also illustrates a point that as you may move forward and make progress with technology, that sometimes you lose something. In the case of lighthouses, you lost the keepers, the people who lived it. Once you could automate the lights, and you lost the human presence. And it's taken a good amount of time to kind of get back to having a human presence with a lot of these lighthouses, to getting you know, some of the preservation groups that take care of them. Really, the preservation groups are the new keepers of the lights. Coast Guard is still caring for the lights if they're still used for navigation, but not caring for the buildings for the most part. So, nonprofit organizations, in some cases community governments, are caring for them. The American Lighthouse Foundation, just a quick commercial, cares for 20 lighthouses in the Northeast. It's based now in the Keeper's House at the Owl's Head Lighthouse as of last year. And I live in Portsmouth, and we have a chapter of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. It's on my hat. And we take care of 2 lighthouses, Portsmouth Harbor Light and Whaleback Light in Kittery. And you know, it takes everybody who cares about lighthouses. I just would request that you do something to help lighthouses, whether it's a donation or volunteer time or whatever it may be, because they need all the help. They need all of us to help them, to keep them standing and burning into the future. So these are a few websites. American Lighthouse Foundation website, lighthousefoundation.org. My website is newenglandlighthouses.net. I do give tours in my minivan a couple of days a week. I might expand next year, a little bit up in the air right now, but I might be doing more tours next year. Right now it's a couple of days a week. The schedule is on my site, newenglandlighthousetours.com. Friends of Flying Santa, I haven't mentioned that at all, but that's a tradition that goes back to 1929 of flying over the lighthouses in small planes and dropping presents for the keepers. Edward Rowe Snow did it for over 40 years. It's now done by a nonprofit, Friends of Flying Santa, by helicopter to Coast Guard stations as a way of saying thank you to Coast Guard families. So that's something else I recommend you check out. I'm very involved with that too. So, thank you so much. I know I've gone kind of long here. Anybody have any questions about anything at all?
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm Dave Roberts. I'm a ham radio operator.
Yes.
And I had the honor of being at Thatcher Island for 3 years.
Oh.
And last year I spent the night in the North Tower. We put amateur radio stations in the tower. People come through to see the lighthouse. We explain what we're doing.
Yeah.
And it tends to draw the people in.
Sure.
And
cool.
And sleeping in the lighthouse is a very interesting experience.
It is. Yeah, Thatcher Island is a great place. I love Thatcher Island.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I wasn't able to talk about it. I can't fit everything in.
There's a lot of history there too, but there's a lot of history on all of them. I just thought I had to mention that because it was quite fun. I'm going to be able to do that again this year.
Oh, good. That's great.
So we contact all. There's amateur radio stations and lighthouses all around the United States and in Europe, and we all communicate with one another.
Yeah, I know about that. I don't totally understand it, but I know about it.
It's more in a, when you communicate, then you exchange cards and people collect them. And he who has the most lighthouses wins.
Yeah. I've seen it in operation. Yeah, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, but you mentioned Thatcher Island. It's another place you can visit. It's a great place to visit. The Twin Lights of Thatcher Island off Rockport, Mass. Anybody else? Any comments or questions or anything? No? Okay, well, thank you again, and I do have some copies of a couple of my books if anybody's interested. The Lighthouse Handbook is $20, the other ones are $15, just so you know.